Well, welcome to Resiliency Within. I'm Elaine Miller-Karas, your host today. And I just want to say, as we get started, I want to do a call out to all of our friends, colleagues, and individuals that we know from Colorado. And we just want to send them, our thoughts, our prayers, that you're in our heart. And if there's something that the Trauma Resource Institute might be able to do to help all the folks up there, we understand that 1,000 people lost their homes, and I think there are 200 other structures that were lost, and that we really are thinking about them today. And here we are, January 3rd, starting the year, and I had planned to begin the new year with a discussion of the important themes beautifully discussed in 2015 by Archbishop Desmond Tutu and His Holiness the Dalai Lama, expressed in their work, The Book of Joy, with my friend and colleague, my guest today, Reena Patel, another licensed clinical social worker. And then sadly, Desmond Tutu died on December 26th. So Reena and I spoke, and we thought, oh my goodness, his death, of course, does not diminish his message. We decided there's no better way to memorialize him than to remind all of us of his message in today's show. And before we get started, I want to share a little bit about Reena Patel. First of all, she earned her master's in social work in 2009 from the Tata Institute of Social Sciences in Mumbai, India, as a Rotary Foundation Ambassador Scholar from the USA to India. And I have to say, I was very lucky to go to Mumbai with Reena in 2019, where we trained some of the social workers there in the community resiliency model. But after she earned her MSW, Ms. Patel worked in a variety of community mental health settings, including both the San Carlos Apache and Pasco Yaqui tribal nations, the United States Navy in Naples, Italy, and with organizations in San Diego and Tucson, Arizona, focusing on homelessness and substance use. Ms. Patel taught as a faculty associate for Arizona State University School of Social Work, and most recently has taught courses in diversity and oppression. Ms. Patel identifies as a first-generation South Asian American woman with roots in, am I saying this right, Gujarat, India?
Gujarat.
Yeah. Gujarat. Okay, you'll have to, help me be more pronunciation specific. She's the director of education and training for the Trauma Resource Institute and has been instrumental in creating TRI's Equity, Diversity, and Inclusion Committee. As I said, Reena and I, we traveled to New Delhi and Mumbai in 2019, where we both were honored to be in the presence of His Holiness the Dalai Lama at the launch of the Sea Learning Program. So today, what we want to do is to create a dialogue between the two of us to the question posed by His Holiness the Dalai Lama and Desmond Tutu. This has never been more important, I think, than in our world today, is how do we attain joy in such a sorrowful world? We just talked about what happened in Colorado, but I talked to another friend today who lives in Denver, who shared with me that his sister had died from COVID in Tulsa, Oklahoma in August. Our dear friend Michael Sapp's mother died the day before Christmas Eve on the 23rd. There's just been so much sorrow. And I know many of you that are listening have had your own sorrows. So it's important that we also talk about, I guess, what else is true. And we want to share a little bit as we get started with some elements about Reverend Tutu's life. So after Nelson Mandela was sworn in as president, he asked Desmond Tutu to chair South Africa's landmark Truth and Reconciliation Commission to investigate the crimes of apartheid. For the Archbishop, the horrific testimony was traumatic, and his empathy and compassion were immeasurable as he wept with the survivors. He heartfully insisted that we humans were meant for goodness. He said, one has been deeply humbled by those we have often called the ordinary people, deeply humbled in their resilience at the magnanimity of spirit that they have shown. He also shared this experience never shook his faith in God. Perhaps if one listened only to the atrocities and account of the atrocities that people committed, but we were constantly being boiled over by the extent to which people were ready and willing to forgive. He said he called himself the prisoner of hope and went on to say, there is no situation from which God cannot extract good. Evil, death, oppression, injustice, these can never again have the last word, despite all appearances to the contrary. So today we celebrate the life of Desmond Tutu, and we'll remember the conversation between these two amazing Nobel Prize winners. One, the exile spiritual leader of the Tibetan people, His Holiness the Dalai Lama, and the other, Reverend Tutu, who was the leading spokesperson for the rights of Black South Africans, who drew national attention to the horrors of apartheid. They spent a week together in 2015, reflecting about their lives, sharing their wisdom. Oh my gosh, they were so humorous, etched with their humor, compassion, spirit, and I would have to say spunk. And many years ago, while I was attending the Skoll conference at Oxford, I had the privilege to see Reverend Tutu in person being interviewed by his daughter. And he had a wonderful spirit that lit up the auditorium, I have to say. During the conversation, His Holiness and Reverend Tutu agreed on the positive qualities that can help all of us experience joy, not as fleeting emotion, but as an enduring part of life. So we're going to address some of the pillars of joy. There are 8 pillars of joy that they outline in the Book of Joy. And as Reena and I were preparing, we realized we probably are not going to get to all 8, but we'll try to get to as many as possible. So Reena, my dear friend and colleague, as we begin, what are your reflections about Desmond Tutu and his life's work?
Oh, Elaine, wow. Just even hearing you talk about Archbishop Tutu and just some of his words, the powerful words that he left with us. As in reading this book and thinking about the life that he led, I think about the example that he was for all of us. There often people call him, a moral voice for humanity. And there was a quote that really stood out to me from the book that I would like to read. He said, "You show your humanity by how you see yourself, not as apart from others, but from your connection to others." And in almost every story he told, he led with that. He led with the connection to the other person, to the other human being across from him, and what helped keep him connected to other people that were different from him. I think that's such an example for how we can lead our lives today. He was also such a humble man. And I think that was something else that really stood out to me about his life, is that he walked with such humility, and it was, and somebody who is such a moral leader, such a huge spiritual leader in our world, who could demand that type of opulence. He never once wanted any of that, right? He just wanted to be treated as any other fellow person on this earth. So really, that's really what stands out to me, is just the kind of example he was for all of us. And the kind of joy that he led with his life amidst all of the suffering that he witnessed, that he led people through, that he was still so joyful and playful in spirit.
He was, and he had a great giggle. I mean, that was, I think, one of the most, this giggle in this wonderful way that he would smile, that you couldn't help but smile back at him because it was so infectious. But, there was something else that that you shared with me too, that you said had struck you. And that was that he referred to something called righteous anger. Could you say a little bit about what that means?
Yeah, so he talked about righteous anger, and I thought this was so interesting. He, of course, during the apartheid and what his role and really helping to mobilize his people, he talked about this idea of righteous anger, that it wasn't anger that was meant to harm other people. It was anger in wanting to make sure harm wasn't done to others. And so having that anger, that righteous anger that really led, he said, to justice, really not wanting to see his fellow humans being hurt or harmed. And that was the anger that motivated the justice and the fight for equality and for freedom and for liberation and for peace and love. So it was just a beautiful way to think about how many of us have experienced and talked about righteous anger, and how he really demonstrated that in such a peaceful way, in a way that didn't mute the oppression that was going on by any means, but really gave him that fire, the energy to really lead such a powerful movement.
Well, and I love the way that you said the energy to lead such a powerful movement, because I think I've often gotten this question when I've brought the community resiliency model to different theaters around the world. I can remember one woman in Turkey who said, I don't want to be in the resilient zone because I have to be angry about what's happening to the Syrian refugees at the border. And I think what I said back to her is that if we're in that kind of anger that's not righteous, that's when we can, sometimes that anger could spill over to sometimes being more violent and aggressive. And oftentimes when we do that, people can't hear us in the same way. But when we have the righteous anger that's connected to justice, what you said, the spreading of love, hope, forgiveness, that's a different kind of anger, and anger that we don't want to lose, because that anger has prompted many of us to change systems, to change the world. And if we didn't have that righteous anger, like what happened in South Africa, apartheid might still be there. And there's so many different elements in our world right now. And I think if I always try to think about his legacy is, as our listeners are hearing us talk about this, is there something that you feel righteously angry about, that you might want to be that person who's going to stand up for something that, again, comes from the spirit of nonviolence to change something that is wrong? And I think that's certainly what he leaves with me, which is also in the spirit as we enter January of Martin Luther King, when we think about, movements of nonviolence that was also embraced by Desmond Tutu. And of course, definitely by His Holiness, the Dalai Lama. So any other reflections before we move into the first pillar? Anything else you want to say, Reena?
The other piece that comes to me is that he really also exemplified what it meant to transcend those systems, those artificial borders and systems that are created often to separate us. I think about his relationship with His Holiness, the Dalai Lama, and how they describe their relationship, both devout in their faiths and still yet so loving and respectful towards one another. And it seemed as if the Archbishop Tutu did this in his life with almost everyone that he met, and even people that may have hurt and harmed other people, as well as we know from the Truth and Reconciliation Commission that he showed so much grace for those individuals. Yeah.
Yes, and having that view, one Christian, one Buddhist, and how they could come together, certainly in love and admiration and respect for each other, and talk about some of the greatest issues of the world, and come up with these 8 pillars of what we all can think about, I think. And we hope that, we're going to talk about at least 3 of them today. We're going to see if we can get through more. But what we're going to do is Reena and I are going to have a continued conversation. So we're going to eventually talk about all 8 pillars. And Reena will come back again each month until we have been able to have this dialogue between the 2 of us regarding the importance of how we can embrace these 8 pillars in our lives and really kind of come forward with the same spirit of Desmond Tutu and His Holiness the Dalai Lama. Again, when we talk about 2 such spiritual leaders and such humble men, how we can also lead with our humility. And actually humility is one of the pillars. So as we move through the very first pillar is perspective. And I want to say a little bit about that, and then Reena and I will talk a little bit more. So the Dalai Lama recommends studying each situation from different perspectives. When we view a situation from a different perspective, actions can have more clarity. I think we've heard the old adage, if walk in someone's moccasins, that will also give you perspective to, as close as you can be, to have a perspective of another person that might be different from your own. So the same event can appear as a tragedy or as an opportunity. And we are invited to reflect on the learning, to find the learning in failure, and also to find the joy in pain. In the Trauma Resource Institute, we talk about the movement to the we. And when we focus only on the self, that perspective is limited. And so it's imperative for all of us to try to widen our lens and say, well, if that was me, if that was my family, if that was my community, if that was my country, what would it be that I would want? I guess that comes back to the golden rule in Christianity, to do unto others as we would have done unto ourselves. That is so imbued also in perspective. So a question for you, Reena. How have your experiences living and studying social work in India influenced your understanding of perspective?
Significantly, Elaine. I think, in thinking about this particular pillar, one of the things that I really took away from it is, how do we, as you mentioned earlier, how do we widen our perspective to include so much more than our own suffering and our own self, which can really be difficult to do, especially in times that are difficult or in turmoil. And I think when I went to India as a Rotary Scholar, and I was fortunate to go and to do my master's there, there's so much about that experience that really shook my entire world. My family's from India, from Gujarat specifically. Um, and, I didn't know what it was like to be there. I had been born and raised in the United States. And I said, I want to go back and I want to see where my family is from. I want to experience it, but I want to experience it in this lens as a social worker, because I really feel strongly about, that the kind of work social workers do, interacting with systems and people and communities. And I thought that would be the best way to learn. While I was there, there was, and I think I've shared this with you, Elaine, when I did my master's thesis, I did not realize there had been a genocide in Gujarat, India in 2002. And I was really intrigued by what had happened in this place of my ancestral homeland. And I decided to, really to dig deep and to see what I could find. And what I realized was that there was, my family, my ethnic background as a Hindu Gujarati were very much part of a genocide that had happened against the Muslim Gujarati community there. Tens of thousands of people and communities were displaced, businesses were burned down, and really the Muslim community in Gujarat were pushed to the peripheries of the cities. And so I thought, this is what I need to spend my thesis on, as I want to go see what type of impact this ethnic political violence had on the youth. Specifically, what I ended up studying was the justice-seeking behavior of the youth and well-being factors of the youth. And this was in 2008 and 2009 that I did this. And I really want to speak to what happened when I got there. When I got there, my last name was synonymous with those of the perpetrators of the violence in the communities. There was no hiding behind that. I was honest with the communities I went to. I knew there were no other Hindus around for miles and miles. And so there was a bit of courage that was taken for me to go.
Oh my goodness, I can imagine. But I've known you to be a courageous person. So I'm not surprised that you went there.
I went there. And it's nothing compared to the courage that these families and these children had to endure with the displacement and the things that had happened to them. And when I got there, I think what I was struck by the most, and I think about this in terms of our pillars, and the perspective one specifically, is they were so generous and kind to me as somebody who was identified, as part of the group of the oppressor, right? The group that had done harm. Mm-hmm. And specifically the children were so gracious. Mm-hmm. And full of joy. I really could say it was full of joy, and they had really lost everything. There were no schools. Many of the places had no running water. People were still living in these relief camps, even 6 years after this violence. But the kids took me by the hand and they showed me every part of their lives with such joy, with no expectation of anything in return from me. And so, I think about that perspective and what I learned from those children, and really what that did to me as a social worker coming back to the United States and having similar experiences. And I think that's really helped me with my own trauma history, and even what that means for my own life, to be able to be given that type of perspective, to know, that you're not alone in the world and you're suffering, and that there's so much out there that's so much bigger than us.
Well, even as you start talking about this too, I think, gosh, in the eyes of the children there, or the other adults that may have seen you as representing the perpetrators of the genocide, and then to embrace you in kind of a loving joy and saying, learn about our community. And isn't that the way that we need to go forward in terms of creating bridges? Absolutely. Where there has been so much divisiveness in the world? So that's just such a beautiful example. Now, I know that you were thinking about a question you wanted to ask me.
Absolutely.
Okay, so all right. So I'll try to do my best. So what's the question?
So Elaine, both His Holiness the Dalai Lama and Archbishop Tutu discuss the importance of our common humanity throughout the book. As author Douglas Abrams highlights, that although we're biologically wired to cooperate with one another for survival, we're more wary of others that don't look like us, that may look different than us. He says that's really the root of prejudice, is that we're not necessarily wired to do that. These great spiritual leaders, however, discuss how essential seeing ourselves as one and not separate is essential for the continuation of our humanity. How do you think we can cultivate this common humanity amongst groups that are different from our own?
Oh my goodness, that's such a difficult question. Well, I'll do my best. Well, first of all, I think that I've always kind of looked at life in this way. And I think it has to do with my childhood. And, you and I have had many conversations about this, is my mom came to this country from El Salvador. And she and my grandmother lived in San Francisco. My mom came as kind of the Rosie the Riveter during a time during the war when they needed more workers. And, having my mom's influence and my grandmother's influence and visiting in El Salvador and knowing that we had so many people in my family, all different colors, from very light skinned like myself and my mother was light skinned as well, to Moreno like my grandmother, and to very dark skinned. I never thought about someone who was looking, I know this sounds interesting. I never thought about someone who looked differently from me in terms of skin color as not being like me. And I think that was just embedded in me as a child. And so then, of course, as you grow and you realize what His Holiness and Desmond Tutu talked about, is that when we see people as being different from us, that sometimes we create divisiveness. And you can see that too when people are, it's not necessarily the way that we look. I certainly saw this in Northern Ireland when that person may look exactly the same, but the looking is different in terms of religion, someone being Catholic and someone being Protestant, for example. And so, but I guess what I've seen, and actually you helped me with this, Reena, when we were in India, and I was grappling with this issue of trying to figure out how best to come forward in the world in embracing diversity and inclusion, and feeling that there was some fallback from some people who had come to me and said, are you really representing what you're saying you're representing in the world? And I don't know if you remember, but you said to me, Elaine, of all the organizations I know, I think you've probably trained more people in different colors and different languages and different ethnicities and religions than any other nonprofit that I know of. And I remember saying, oh, I hadn't thought about that, but I was thinking about, in Haiti, in Nepal, in the Philippines, in China, the different places that I've gone. And what I've seen most importantly is exactly what you talked about with the children that embraced you. When I've gone into different countries, people have sometimes looked at me suspiciously, which I think is probably a healthy wariness of who is this person and what are they coming to share. But that was only sometimes a moment. And then all of a sudden, there is this commonality that develops between us. Mm. Maybe it's the way that we come forward with a smile, or maybe there's a way that we come forward with saying we're trying to share something that is about all humanity. And I know that you've heard me say this before, and I think our listeners who've listened to the show before, is that we are all designed in the same way. We have this amazing nervous system. I've asked the same 6 questions all over the world, and I get the same answers about, what is the suffering that you've seen and how has it shown up with your emotions and your body and your thoughts? And people tell me the same thing, whether I'm in California or I'm in Tibet, or in Nepal. So I'm thinking, well, how can that be that we're so separate when we're so similar? And so that's not to say I don't absolutely respect our differences and embrace our differences, because that also enlightens us. But I think what I have seen more commonly throughout the world is how when we take away those, the barriers that sometimes exist and come person to person, that we see ourselves in the other. And I think that's why perspective is so important, right? Is we see ourselves in the other. We see a person who wants to go to shop and not have to worry about my shopping center being blown up. We want to be able to go to our temple, our synagogue, our church, and we want to be able to have our religious practices without fear. We want to raise our children and love them. We want, not to be worried about that we don't have a house to live in or food to feed our family. All these things are so common, and yet we know there's disparities in the world. But when we see our common humanity, then how can we not help our fellow person, no matter where we are on the globe? And I think probably the thing that's sometimes I think in the past, when I was much younger, when I'd see something in the news, it was like something happened over there. Now I feel like when something happened, it happens to me personally. And I've certainly felt this way very much when I saw the faces of starving children in Afghanistan. And I want to say, well, how can I help them? There's an Afghani restaurant in Claremont, and I went and spoke to the owner, and I said, if there's any way that I can somehow contribute money to help these children. He actually gave me a website to go to, and I contributed some money, but I didn't always see it as so personal as I do now. But I think it was this, this common humanity that you were asking me about, that I've seen all over the world. Any reflection upon that before we take our break?
Desmond Tutu talked about that concept of Ubuntu, right? I am because we are, that interdependence that you're talking about. And it's such a beautiful concept that your heart is aching for somebody across the world, right? And that is really what he was talking about, that we are a collective in that way. We have to be connected. We are connected to one another.
And I think that, you also brought something else up that I'd love for you to share about what the astronauts have seen. Would you share that?
Yeah, the overview effect. I thought this was so neat that when astronauts come back from space, they talk about this overview effect, that they report that once they take a glimpse of Earth from space and they see this blue ball in the midst of this vast black sky, lacking our human-made borders, they never looked at their personal or national interests in the same way again. And it's called the overview effect.
And so that, to me, we talk about perspective, right? That you see ourselves as we see ourselves as one across the world. And that's certainly, I think, the work that I've tried to do in my life. And I think that I also saw in you when I first met you many years ago, that kind of having that common perspective, because I don't know if you remember, but I think you might do. I think I remind you every now and then. I said, we're going to work one day together. I'm not sure what exactly, but we will. I don't know if you believed me then. Maybe you believe me now.
Still don't think I believe you, Elaine.
Well, I just, so listen to this. We've only gotten through one pillar. We have two more pillars that we want to talk about after the break. So we're going to take a short break, and then we're going to come back again with dear Reena Patel, a wonderful social worker in the world. And I just love that you're the Director of Education and Training of the Trauma Resource Institute, Reena. You bring so much wisdom to that role, and we will have more dialogue about the next two pillars that we're going to highlight today. And I think we're going to be talking about generosity and gratitude. Yes. So we'll be back in a few moments with Reena Patel. Well, welcome back. This is Elaine Miller-Karas with Reena Patel, my guest today, and we're talking about the 8 pillars of joy. We're going to talk about 3 pillars today. We just finished talking about perspective, which is pillar number 1, but we're going to go to pillar number 2. When Reena and I were talking about which pillars we wanted to highlight for this beginning of the year, we thought it would be good to talk about gratitude and generosity, and maybe also share some practices that our listeners can do on how they can cultivate the joy in their life. So let's talk a little bit about gratitude now. It's fundamental to joy because it can quite literally allow us to generate our own happiness. And well, what does that mean? The Dalai Lama was grateful, for example, for the opportunities he found in exile. Exile, as he says, brought me closer to reality, he said. When you are in difficult situations, there is no room for pretense. You must confront reality as it is. And further, Christ teaches us to love our enemies. Buddhism invites us to be thankful for them, referring to our enemies as our most precious spiritual teachers. So grateful people were found in studies to be more empathetic and generous. In other studies, grateful people were found to have had more vitality, to have exercised more, to be more likely to have made progress on goals they had set for themselves. That last point is important because it confirms that seeing the world with grateful eyes motivates us rather than lulls us into complacency. So the joy that the Dalai Lama still was able to find in exile did not in any way diminish his efforts to oppose the Chinese occupation of Tibet. Grateful people also reported less stress and fewer physical symptoms. And researchers believe that gratitude may stimulate the hypothalamus, which is the part of our body that regulates stress, and the ventral tegmental region, which is a part of the reward circuitry that produces pleasure in the brain. smiling, a natural expression of gratitude, which I certainly saw in his Desmond Tutu, and also when didn't he smile a lot to His Holiness the Dalai Lama, stimulates the response of neurotransmitters, serotonin, which is kind of our natural antidepressant, and dopamine, which stimulates our reward centers, and endorphins, our natural painkillers. It is not happiness that makes us grateful. It is gratefulness that makes us happy. So when we think about how we're going to cultivate joy, spending time and thinking about our gratitudes is a very important service, not only to humankind, to our families, to our community, but to ourselves. In the Tibetan tradition, monks are taught that the best way to create a good karma with a minimum of effort is to rejoice in good actions and those of others. Grateful people are also perceived as more generous, empathetic, and useful to people around them. So as we start with this particular pillar, what is on your mind about it, Reena?
Well, I know that we're going to share with our viewers a practice. And I have to say that in reading this chapter and understanding this pillar, it resonated with me so deeply, because I've been trying to practice in small ways a gratitude practice that I've been incorporating into my life. And I have found that when I pause to do that, even if it's for 5 minutes, it does have a profound effect on my nervous system, on my brain, on my body, on my perspective, really, and can quickly reframe almost any situation that I encounter, which has been pretty incredible for me, honestly. And it may sound so simple, but hearing about what you just said about the hypothalamus and what that means and what that really does to our stress response, it makes so much sense. Because if I pause to do a practice like this that I know we're going to share, I have seen a significant impact in just my day-to-day being able to do that.
Well, and the other part about this is we have a circuit in our brain that is about gratitude. And that kind of gratitude that we're talking about is something that we can nourish, and as we practice it, it actually can make it stronger in terms of all those side effects that I just talked about. So if you're sitting at home and you're thinking, oh, as you're hearing this, I've been sad, I've been this or that, I'm going to really invite you to start thinking about your gratitudes. And so we're going to ask you some things right now. So in the book, they talked about journaling for gratitude, and the specific daily practice would be at the end of each day. Although I know people that do it at the beginning of the day too, don't you, Reena? That sometimes they will start the day with gratitudes. I think you shared with me that that's what you do at times.
Yep.
So, and that would be the first thing they suggest is recall 3 things from your day from which you can be thankful. So, Reena, I'm going to ask you right now, are there 3 things that you're thankful for at this moment?
Oh, yes. I'm going to say this. I have a heater next to me, so this warmth.
Yes.
I'm being in relationship to you in this moment. I'm very grateful for that. And I think for I'm going to pick my spouse. He's been very, very supportive lately, and I'm just going to pick him as, those are the 3 things that come to mind at this moment.
And so as you say these 3 gratitudes, what they recommend is to write them down in a journal. And then they don't add this, but we're going to add it because we both believe in paying attention to sensations, is to then notice what happens as you write down your gratitudes, or even as you've said them out loud to me, Reena. Do you notice anything happening on the inside as you think about these 3 things that you've mentioned? 3.
I just took a deep breath. I just took a deep breath. I have a pleasant sensation of warmth in my fingers. And I felt some openness happen actually in my chest and shoulders.
So I'm just going to invite you to notice that. And as our listeners are hearing Reena tell us about what she's noticing, as you may be thinking about your gratitudes as we're talking, to also notice what happens on the inside, because that's about you nourishing your nervous system. And it's so interesting. I was thinking about this morning, and I do I don't necessarily, I think about my gratitudes, but not in such a precise way. And I think I need to start doing this more regularly for myself as well. But I sat down, I was talking to my husband this morning, and we have some work being done at our house. And I said, I just have to stop for just a moment and, and ask and just let you know what I'm grateful for today. And maybe we can share. And so he was like thinking, oh my goodness, what's she asking me about? And so this may sound silly, but he was grateful for his fantasy football team that's doing very well right now. And I thought, well, would that count? Well, of course it can count. It doesn't necessarily need to be these, spiritual things that, or even a person. It was like, he loves doing that. He gets much joy in doing that. And as he was saying it out loud, you could just see him take that deep breath, just like you did. So, sometimes think about even the small things in life that maybe you don't think of. Oh, well, I am grateful that I actually right now, this moment have, the ability to go in my kitchen and make a cup of coffee or a cup of tea. And sometimes I think, as you and I both have worked internationally, sometimes the things that we can take for granted when we've had privilege, and then seeing when people don't have the same privileges we have, we can start to be grateful for that as well. And then it always leads me to the next thing. How could I help change the world so that more of the things that create well-being are available to others? I mean, it seems like there's a cascade of thoughts that happen when we start being grateful. I don't know, does that make sense? Do you have anything to say about that?
Well, I have a question for you, Elaine.
Yes,
and it's
okay.
You started to answer it a little bit already.
Did I already? Okay, what's the question?
So as we begin 2022, do you have any reflections on how you plan to integrate a gratitude practice more intentionally in your life? And I'm also curious on if there's any moments that you can recall in everything that you've built that you're grateful for, that you're most grateful for.
Well, it's interesting that you should say. Today I had a conversation. Actually, you were there with the Arab American Family Resource Center in New York City, and I hadn't talked to them since way before the pandemic. We did a community resiliency model teacher training, and one of the individuals we were talking to, her name is Stephanie. She was sharing her joy in teaching the wellness skills to a group of people who were suffering. And when she was describing it to us, I don't know if you felt this way, I could feel tears welling up in my eyes, is that we often don't know, and I think this is what I'm really grateful for, that we may plant a seed in someone's life, and then we don't know how it sprouts and takes root and what comes from it. And I certainly hadn't spoken to them for many, many, many years. And to think that has now continued to sprout and to continue to spread well-being to the point where they want more people trained to be able to teach this to their community. And they do beautiful work in New York City. So I'm grateful for those. And that's just one example, but I think you've heard those moments too, Reena, when someone will say something to us and I think, oh my gosh, how did that happen? That this little idea could spread and create so much well-being in the world.
And Elaine, I'm wondering if you're able to notice anything that's happening on the inside.
Well, I'm just noticing a big old smile, and I just took a deep breath as well. I think that it's also connected to that first pillar that we talked about, because I think that when I'm grateful for that, it also gives me the perspective of like, okay, what else do I need to know about to gain a wider lens? So how this can also help more people. Because I think that's been one of my great missions in my life is how do we bring this forward? And I think your other question is about how to plan to integrate a great gratitude practice in my life. Is that I actually just bought a little book that I think I'm going to be writing in every day, and at least writing down 3 practices. And I thought I could also start talking to my granddaughter, who's 5, a little bit more about what she's grateful for. Although I don't know what she'd say, but it might be, she'd say, oh, Nana, stop talking to me. I'm grateful if you just stop talking, who knows? But we'll see what she has to say. But I think that, I say that I'm grateful for that, but I'm very grateful to a friend's house that I'm at right now. She's allowing me to have the podcast at her house as my house is being worked on. And she's been a dear friend to me. So I feel like she's a member of my family. And so I'm grateful for her, and I'm grateful to you. So I'm also grateful to Matt, the engineer, who always does a great job on Voice America. So I just have to say that about him today too. So you see how you start, it's kind of like when you start talking about gratitudes, it's like, oh my goodness, it's like you're out there and you're fishing and you can get more and more and more and more as that net becomes fuller. So that's what I'm sensing right now. And it's actually making me feel very happy. So thank you for that question.
Of course. And isn't it, so that just took a few minutes, and isn't that incredible what happened in that shift? And so,
what a wise young woman you are. So is there any particular way you're going to be working on your gratitudes this year?
I think I need to do a better job of continuing my practice. There are mornings where I start, and so I would like to just maintain and continue the journaling. And something that they talk about in the book is being as specific as possible, and not choosing the same things over again. And I thought that was interesting, to try to choose different things, because you really, trying to cultivate that and push yourself to think about other things. And for example, the meal on the table, the farmers that had to pick the food, the soil, all of the things, the grocers that had to stock it on the shelves, really getting specific. And I want to practice doing more of that.
Well, I love that, because I think that, in the C learning program, the social, emotional, ethical learning program, they talked about systems thinking and helping children understand that, like, when they have, let's say, a plastic water bottle in front of them, what went into creating all of that, right? So who put the water in the bottle? Who made the plastic? Where did the plastic come from? Was there a factory? Were there people that worked in the factory? Because if we think about that too, it's also connected to perspective. It also helps us think about, well, is that something I want to do? What happens to the plastic after I'm done with it, right? So am I recycling? You see, it's that system then that also looks at how we can change things that may have been things that are not going so well. Like, how do we not pollute our oceans with too much plastic, right?
Or even with food, it's, who's impacted by the foods that we're eating. These are foods that are coming in from other countries that are coming into our grocery store. I mean, there's just so much conversation, like you said, Elaine, especially with young people, that we can have around gaining that perspective. But that's, so we'll keep each other accountable and honest with our practices, I think.
All right, we're gonna have to check. I'm grateful, Reena, that you called me today and reminded me to do my practice. Yes. So how about the next pillar that we're going to talk about? This is the last pillar we'll talk about today, which is generosity. So it is the natural prolongation of compassion. And neuroscience now demonstrates that generosity is one of the 4 fundamental neural circuits for long-term happiness. Generosity also boosts health and longevity. And when I was reading the book, I thought it was so interesting that when someone is generous to us, when we're generous to someone else, or when we're watching generosity to others, that same circuitry lights up. And I thought, oh my goodness, this is a very important thing to cultivate. And the fact that we're designed this way, that we have a circuit in our brain. A neural circuit means we have a circuit in our brain that is wired for happiness. So, and that's why if we practice it, it actually can get stronger. So there are so many nonprofit organizations, for example, that are naturally motivated to participate in a better world. I think that when we started the Trauma Resource Institute, that whole idea was, how can we bring healing to the world, one person at a time, keeping in mind people's cultural practices? So in Buddhist teaching in the book, they talk about 3 forms of generosity. And we talked about this. Let's talk a little bit about this in relationship to our perspectives, Reena. So the first one was the material gift. The second was freeing from fear, which can be offered by protection, advice, consolation. And the third was the spiritual gift, which is transmitting wisdom, moral, and ethical teachings, helping people towards more autonomy. So when we think about that, more autonomy and happiness, are there any thoughts that are coming to mind for you right now?
Well, not to be biased, I know that the show is sponsored by the Trauma Resource Institute, but I also work there. And I when I read this piece about these are the 3 forms of generosity and giving, and I thought, oh my gosh, we do this. This is what we do. This is what we offer in the world. and in such a generous way, whether it be in the form, Elena, you'd mentioned our scholarships, right? Our dedication to making sure that people are able to come to every training that we can, that we offer, freeing from fear, and I thought that was so interesting that can be a form of generosity, right? Something that we give to others. And I think about the wellness skills and what we do in our work, and how many times I've been in a training and I've heard people say that they can have more relief, they can live their life easier, right? Being free from some of those things that really help to keep them, otherwise maybe trapped or in a place that they don't want to be. And that's also the spiritual gift of that transmitting wisdom, the moral and ethical teachings. And so I just, get so excited by this, because I think, for me, this really epitomizes what we do as an organization and as a nonprofit, and the fact that we are so generous in what we have, that if there's anything that we have, we are so ready to give that. And Elaine, you've really been the pioneer in making sure that happens. That's a value for us.
It has. And I've always felt that way. I shared a story with you. Many years ago, there was a person in a state up north, I'll say up north from California, that we gave a scholarship to come to our training. And she was working on a reservation with indigenous children. And she needed a scholarship to be able to come to our training. So through a number of people, we were able to give her the scholarship. There were people that I think loaned her a car, she had a place to stay. And at that time in our history, we didn't have a lot of extra money within the organization. But when I talked to her and the compelling work she was doing with children, I said, oh, we have to get her trained in these wellness skills. And so she came down. And then later she had talked to people when she went back up to her state and was telling them about our generosity. And certainly we didn't expect anything in return. We were just hoping it might help her with her work with children. That I received a $5,000 check in the mail from this amazing donor. And I'll never forget that. My mom used to say to me, what you give out comes back to you 1,000-fold. Mm-hmm. And that certainly has been true regarding the generosity of our organization. And sometimes it hasn't necessarily come back in what we'd say a material, but in even the idea that we talked about earlier of the Arab American Family Resource Center, and hearing that story of how refugees who are coming from so many parts of the world into New York City are getting the benefit of cultivating their well-being in these very simple ways. So that is, I have to tell you that talk about, I'm going to have a smile from ear to ear, this one. It's like, oh my gosh, that's so wonderful. So generosity is definitely something that is so embedded in what we do. But, I want to go a little bit further. When discussing the pillar, Desmond Tutu addresses a question from a young person in South Africa who asks how we can help the world heal and still feel joy in life. His response is to start where you are and realize that you are not meant on your own to resolve all these massive problems. Now, this is something you pulled out of the book, Reena. Can you talk a little bit more about this?
Yeah, and I think this is a great way, as I know that we're ending today and talking about these pillars, that there was this question that really struck me, I think, as a social worker and as somebody, and I know a lot of your listeners can probably relate, as somebody who does feel that interdependence very deeply with my fellow humans. And I've grappled with this question a lot, especially after returning from India and working in some of the communities I have, is how is it okay for me to experience joy in my life when I know there's so much suffering, when I do ache deeply, and I do know that there's a wider perspective, and I do know that people are suffering, and here I am, in Arizona in the United States. And so when this young woman wrote this question in for His Holiness, the Dalai Lama, and for Desmond Tutu, I thought, oh my gosh, this is something that I really need to pay attention to. So I put this here for us to discuss that, his words, and this was actually Archbishop Tutu's words, that start where you are. And then to realize that you're not meant to resolve all of these things on your own, that we can do that really we can rely on one another to really help the situation, and that this isn't, we're just rely on one person's shoulders, that we have a community of people. And Elaine, I'm curious about your thoughts around this, because to me, the work that you do really really does speak to this, that you have seen so much suffering in the world.
I have
And
seen a
how
lot
do
of
you
suffering.
maintain that perspective?
Well, I think that sometimes it touches me so deeply that there is definitely sadness, that I certainly will never want to lose that. But then there's also joy. And I wrote about this in my book, but I think it's something that I would love to share again to our listeners. And I was in Haiti after the terrible earthquake of 2010. And it took us a long, long time to get to this place we're going. We're going to a place that was being run by a nun. And there were like literally, oh my gosh, there was maybe 200 people waiting in the really hot sun, had been waiting for hours for us. And yet they were waiting for us. So it was kind of like that, oh my gosh moment. I don't know what I'm going to say. So all of a sudden I thought, well, I'll just ask her if she'd like, ask the group if there's something they'd like to start our meeting together. And so this woman like raises her hand, she comes up in front of the group, and I would never have thought to do this after so many people had died. 10% of the population died in Haiti after that earthquake. And many of you will know this. She was singing in Creole, which I do not know how to speak, but I certainly knew what she was singing. And it was la 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 la. La 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 la. If you're happy and you know it, clap your hands. The whole group was just up and dancing and clapping. And I have to tell you, there were tears. And at the very end, we were ready to leave after sharing the wellness skills. I'm teaching them a little bit. The nun who ran the camp came up to me and gave me a big hug. And she said to the translator, she goes, "This is the first moment, first day being here with all of you that I've experienced joy again and felt that we were going to be able to go forward." And I thought, that wasn't me, that was the people. It was asking that question and having the joy come forward, that even with all the suffering, that there could be this moment of joy and collective happiness, of a song, of a dance, and about community. And so as I see our time is slipping away, I really want to invite all of you to think about that, with the sorrow that you are experiencing for whatever's happening in your life. As we're starting this new year, are there some ways that you can remember what else is true? We've been talking about that a lot over the last year, but think about your gratitudes. Is there someone that you can go and extend generosity to? And I want to thank my wonderful guest, Reena Patel, for being with me today, and the generosity of who you are, Reena, in bringing this to the show today and sharing your wisdom. Is there anything you'd like to say as we end today?
Just expressing my gratitude to you, Elaine. Thank you so much for giving so many of us a voice and a platform and a way to express our thoughts and love for the things that we do. Thank you.
Well, and this is one of the things I'm so grateful for, is to have this opportunity for you to spread your thoughts and your wisdom to a broader audience, so more people can know the person that I've known for many years, and that can hear the pearls that you can share with us all. So listeners, until we meet again, this is Elaine Miller-Karas signing off for Resiliency Within, with a deep bow of gratitude for Reena Patel. And just know that you can reach her through the Trauma Resource Institute. Thank you.
Thank you.
All right, terrific show. We're all clear.
Thank you, Matt.
Thank you, Matt.
I'm grateful to you, Matt. I hope you heard.
Oh, you're very welcome. Thank you.
All right. Now, we're still on Facebook Live. If there's anything more you want to say.
I would finish reading that quote that Desmond Tutu said that we were just talking about, if that's okay.
Yeah, please.
So he said in response to that young woman's question from South Africa about the joy and the suffering, he says, "As an old man, I can say, start where you are and realize that you are not meant to on your own to resolve all of these massive problems. Do what you can. It seems so obvious, and you will be surprised actually at how it can get to be catching."
I love that. It's contagious in a positive way, right? We talk about contagion of course, the horrible virus, but there's also the contagion of joy. And I know that we will talk more about it, because we have 6 more pillars to go. And we were so right
That's
to
right.
know that we were not going to, we thought, oh, we'll do all 8 pillars. No possible
Yeah.
way.
Although
We
I
could do it.
am very proud of us that we got through the 3. So
I
that's
know, and we did it so effortlessly, Rita. I just can't believe it. So I know you have much to do today. So I'm just going to thank you so much again for being on the show. And I know we'll talk to you very soon again. So thank you so much again.
Thank you, Elaine.
You're welcome. Bye-bye.